Good morning. So for Brother Mike, we're going to say we're done with the lesson. We're going to move to time to eat. Maybe not. Maybe I was just kidding. I did forget my notes though. So yeah, busy with food, I guess. So it's all right. Remember what I studied. Does everybody have a quarterly? Does anybody need one? Okay. Do you want a big one or a small one? Big one? Okay. All right. There you go. Sure. All right. Does anybody remember what we studied last week? First Kings, yeah. So it's only 7 days ago. So it's not that long ago. What did we study last week? Yeah. David, we studied David for a long time, right? David is in many different books. He's also in the Psalms, which we had 2 quarters. And we had a quarter before that. So I think we spent almost 3 quarters on David. We're not going to spend 3 quarters on Solomon. But we will have Proverbs coming up and some other things. So yes, so David's life ends. And what was something that God did not let David do in his reign? Right, he didn't let him build the temple. Why not? He was a man of war and shed blood, right? And so he did appreciate the fact that David thought about him and thought about his house. He did tell him that he could not build the temple, but what did he tell him? He could prepare everything. So there's a lot of preparations. Right. So he was connected to it. He didn't do it himself, but he was connected to it. If you're going to do anything, there's a lot of planning. I mean, if you look at our cars in the parking lot, the last step was buying it. But there was lots of steps before that, right? Even thinking of the design and engineering and who's going to build what parts and where they're going to come from. And it was years in the planning for just one car in the parking lot. And just similar to that, for this temple, David did do the planning. And on top of that, he also got the materials. So that's something that's a benefit to Solomon. He didn't have to try to figure out what all materials were needed and where to get them from and all that. David pretty much had that going on. Also workers. David had kind of figured some of that out too. So Solomon knew about all this, of course, as he's growing up, and he also knew God said one of his sons was going to, he didn't know which one, you know, if he's going to be the one, but he did obviously prepare for it. So right. That was a big promise, right? And is that called the Davidic covenant? Some places I think it is. That was a big thing. So in and amongst all that discussion, the Lord was pleased with David and said that his kingdom would live forever and that the Savior would come from his lineage. And so that's a pretty big thing. So no small thing at all. It's God's recognition of David's service. David was still a sinner, we know that, but David was also faithful to the Lord much of his life. And it was a great blessing to David for God to give him that. Mm-hmm. And the threshing floor that he bought was on top of the mountain. And I don't have my notes, so I'm guessing Ornan, or I forgot how do you say it. He offered to just give it to David, but David said, no, I'm going to give you a fair price for it. I'm going to pay for it. And this will be the site of where the temple will be built. And so all of these things we talked about happened over many years. It wasn't in the last week, the last 7 days, or a month. This is over years and years and years, all these things happened. And so from the time that David talked about the temple being built until the temple actually got built was basically after David was already gone. And so David didn't see it for himself, but of course Solomon was the one that brought it all together. So how old was Solomon? When we think Solomon, I think of old. Somebody says Solomon, I think old. Maybe because in the Bible, but whatever reason. But how old is Solomon in the time we're talking about right now? Yeah, he's 19, 20 years old. He's young. Can you imagine being responsible for Israel as the king at that age, and then having a project of the size of building the temple at that time? And last week, we saw Solomon become king, and even that, God's fingerprints were on that whole situation, because Adonijah, David's oldest surviving son, was on track to declare himself king. And in fact, I think Solomon only preceded him by moments based on what you read in the Bible. And so it was, all the events were coming together for him to make a declaration. And wisely, Nathan and Bathsheba and others advised David that they need to move quickly, and they did. And so they declared Solomon as the king, and followed the Lord's will. There are a few people that Solomon had to deal with. Do we remember any of those people? So one of them was Adonijah. That was obvious because that was the oldest son. Anybody remember Joab? Yeah, he was a warrior, right? He was a very experienced warrior. Right. Right. So those three lost their lives, and it was God's will that that would happen, that there wouldn't be any opposition to Solomon's kingdom. And then we see in 1 Chronicles 29:28, David died in a good old age, full of days, riches, and honor, and Solomon his son reigned in his stead. So there was a successful handoff of power from David to Solomon. And one of the last things David explained to Solomon is if he obeyed the Lord would prosper him, but if he disobeyed, the Lord would punish him. And so that was one of the most important things that David passed on to Solomon after a life of being the king. He wanted to make sure that Solomon really had a good understanding of what was important. We talked about David being a warrior king. Also, he was a musician, and he wrote the Psalms, and he also he did a lot of things related to all of that. Solomon was really more of a scholar. He wrote the Proverbs. While David is known for his battles, Solomon is known for his wealthy splendor. And then we saw last week that Solomon was asked from God, what do you want? It's an open question. He didn't ask for wisdom. He didn't ask for a new Mustang. He didn't ask for anything. Somebody said, hey, what do you want? My dad said, what do you want? And I was 19 years old. That would be what I would have said. I want a brand new Mustang, 396 engine. I could tell him all the specs, everything. That's what I would have said. But here, Solomon was already showing wisdom in the way that he responded to God. So obviously David did something right with Solomon and preparing him for what was to come. Solomon asked for wisdom. So here in 2 Chronicles 1, 8 through 10, and Solomon said unto God, Thou hast showed great mercy unto David my father, and hast made me to reign in his stead. And that's him amongst all of his brothers. He was the one. And it wasn't, oh, you go ahead, Solomon, you go ahead and take over. We're good with it. It wasn't anything like that. Now, O Lord God, let thy promise unto David my father be established, for thou hast made me king over a people like the dust of the earth in multitude. Give me now wisdom and knowledge, that I may go out and come in before the people. For who can judge this thy people that is so great? And so it wasn't wisdom to be rich. It wasn't wisdom to do a great job in the stock market or Bitcoin or whatever you want to say. It was to serve the people. And so he asked for wisdom, but he also asked for it for a specific reason. And so it wasn't lost on God that he asked him the question, and he answered it about as good a way as anyone could answer that question. And Solomon really did recognize that he was the king over Israel, not because of his own ability, but because of God's choosing. Right. He was going to give him the rest of it, exactly. Yeah, kind of a surprise for Solomon. And that was from 2 Chronicles 1, 11, 12. And God said to Solomon, because this was in thine heart, and thou hast not asked riches, wealth, honor, nor the life of thine enemies, neither hast asked long life, but hast asked wisdom and knowledge for thyself, that thou mayest judge my people, over whom I have made thee king. Wisdom and knowledge is granted unto thee, and I will give thee riches and wealth and honor, such as none of the kings have had that have been before thee, neither shall there any after thee have the like. That was a huge promise that God made to Solomon. And so how do you think God made that happen? There was peace, right? With all the neighboring countries. How often do you have peace? Is that a pretty fragile thing to keep in place? And all those leaders of those neighboring countries weren't necessarily the same leaders that whole time either. Leaders changed over during that period of time. Also, what about within his own country? What about rebellions within his within his own country? The Lord held those back as well. You know, there was opposition. There were people that liked being warriors. They liked going out and beating up on the neighboring countries. And so I'm certain that some of those same people said, hey, let's fight some more. We like to do it. We're good at it. And Solomon had to say, yeah, no, that's not what we're doing right now. We don't see examples of that really, but people's nature gets to be a certain way. And even though Solomon had the right heart, it didn't mean that everybody else necessarily did when they started. The Lord gave Solomon what he requested, wisdom and knowledge. Solomon's life was a good example of what the Lord told us to do in Matthew 6:33. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. And then in Proverbs, what Solomon wrote later, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge. All right, there's last week. So this week, so the next part is this is the real focus, or one of the focus areas for Solomon was to rule, but also was to continue the work that David had done. David had prepared for the building of the temple, and now Solomon was going to actually do it. And so starting a project is always a big thing. And as we said, the site of the temple was on top of Mount Moriah. That's where Ornan's threshing floor was. David provided the workers, the hewed stones, gathered iron, and cedar wood. And so it's kind of a nuance there, but when you see somebody building a house, what usually happens? Yeah, you do the foundation, do the framing, all that stuff, then you do the inside, but there's a lot of noise. Trucks come in, pounding this and that, dumping things off. Lots of hammers, or nail guns now, I guess, but it's all pretty loud, right? Putting everything together. And if you're living in a neighborhood, we did, live in a neighborhood, and you wake up every morning to hammering, you know pretty much construction is going on. But it says that that wasn't the case in this example, because everything that was provided was already prepared as it should be. So when it says David provided hewed stones, those stones were already ready to put together. They didn't take the stones and do the stone cutting right there on site and try to make everything go together. It was already fit together, or already made like it was supposed to in the final form. The cedar wood was provided. We'll talk about that a little bit more. David instructed the priests that were going to serve in the temple, the ones that were going to be the musicians and the gatekeepers. The other thing that had been collected was the multi-tons of gold, silver, and bronze collected that would be valued in the hundreds of billions of dollars today. That sounds like a lot of money. And so the Lord provided that to them. They gathered that through conquering other nations and by other means. David urged his son to serve the Lord with a perfect heart and with a willing mind. And he also said, if thou seek him, he will be found of thee, but if thou forsake him, he will cast thee off forever. He remembered what happened to Saul. That was pretty fresh in David's memory. David spent much of his life running away from Saul because Saul wasn't following God. And so he got to see firsthand what it was like when the king was rebellious and the king didn't follow what the Lord wanted him to do. So what else do you need when you're going to build something? Yeah, you need workers. So you just go grab first person you see outside and say, here's a hammer and let's go do this thing. Craftsman. So craftsman is somebody who knows what they're doing. So you probably know this already, but there's not so many trees in Israel. So when he talks about crafting wood, did they have people right there that knew how to craft wood very well in Israel? Right, right. A whole nother country. So in order to do that successfully, he wasn't asking for one thing like when you go to Silver Dollar City and you see something, it's like, oh, that looks really nice. That's usually what Darla says. It's like, okay, we got to get one of those. It's not like that. You got to have enough for the whole temple, right? So you're not talking about going and buying one thing that took a craftsman maybe a couple of weeks or whatever to make. You're talking about something for the whole temple, which would be years and years of craftsman work. And so I don't have my notes, so I might be jumping around. I apologize for that. I know where my notes are. They're just not here. So as far as the whole thing with the wood goes, so there was a king, and the king that he had to deal with actually already had an agreement with David, and sorry, it's my other book. So it was Hiram, the king of Tyre, And he was the one that had cedar trees and carpenters and masons. And he already had a relationship with David before all this happened. And this was Solomon following up and asking whether or not Hiram would work with him to provide the materials. Hiram, if you look at 1 Kings 5:1, it says that Hiram was ever a lover of David. And so we should probably go look at that. 1 Kings chapter 5. Okay. Who would like to read 1 Kings chapter 5? It's 18 verses. Thank you, Brother Homer. That was a lot. Thanks for reading that. So I think it's just the same for us too, right? If we want to be successful, then we have to work with other people. It doesn't tell us whether Hiram was a servant of God or not. I know one writer said didn't really know for sure. Could have been that David somehow convinced him to serve the Lord, but it wasn't obvious that he was. obviously he was committed to this relationship with Solomon, and he followed through with everything that he said he was going to do. Hiram was a blessing for the building of the temple. He had the materials, he had the raw materials. He was willing to convert the materials into something usable, and even transported it to Israel for David. So he pretty much took care of all the logistics, not only of just growing everything in the first place, but all the handling of it and all the transportation of it and getting it there in a usable form for them to do it. So that was great. And Tyre they were the ones that knew how to do it. They had the trees, they knew how to do it, they had the craftsmen, as we just said a moment ago. But it wasn't a one-sided thing. Solomon provided all of this food, and let's see, I know I have my notes. I write my notes in different places. So if you look at the amount that David sent, it was a lot. So if you think about how much that it takes to feed a person in one day, it's about 1.1 liters of wheat per day. So think of a 2-liter bottle. We might have one in the back if we want a demonstration. Halfway filled it with wheat. That would feed one person. And we're talking about 120,000 measures of wheat and 120,000 measures of oil. So multiply what we were just saying by 240,000. And so if you think of this way, if you think of the large size tankers that show up for the gas station, it would be 5 or 6 of those full. Yeah, yearly. And once again, so we can't go even 1 week without talking about the parable of the sower. So when you plant wheat, what do you get? You get wheat. But it takes time. You plant the seed, it takes months to grow, and then you have to harvest it, then you have to process it. You have to go through many, many steps, so it takes a very long time to do all of that. And so what was Solomon providing? He was providing something really valuable back to Tyre. It was like us going to the grocery store. You know, the difference between going to the grocery store and buying something versus growing it yourself. And so it was a mutually beneficial arrangement that they had, and Hiram provided the workers and the craftsmen and the wood and even the barges to get it to Israel, and then Solomon loaded it up with the food to send back the other direction. And they did this every single year of the construction, which looked like it was 7 years. So that was a pretty significant commitment. If you think about it this way too, Tyre, was this the only thing they were doing as a country? Was their whole focus just on helping build this temple? Not really. They had other things to do. They had to run their own country, so they put a priority on this and making this happen at the same time they were doing the other things that they had to do. One of the points that the writer made was that when Solomon asked for wisdom at the beginning of his reign, this is evidence that it wasn't just a one-time event, that the Lord gave him wisdom to handle the next couple of things that came up, but it was something that God continued to pour out wisdom onto Solomon the whole entire time that he reigned. And so God followed through on his promise that as long as Solomon was faithful, he would do that, and he was certainly doing it in this situation. Yeah, well, he's still a sinner, right? And you look at everybody in the Bible, and everybody's a sinner, but it's how much of a sinner were they? Some didn't try to follow God at all, were just wicked the whole time. Solomon, David, they had things that they did, and their weakness was similar as far as that goes.
Caused him to build temples for them in
Mm-hmm. Which was completely against God. Yeah. So even though he was wise and understood what he needed to do, doesn't mean that he would actually do what he needed to do, right? And that happens to us too. We know what we should do. There's situations where the Lord makes us wise enough that, yeah, we know the next step we should take. We know the next thing we should do. Or the other side, we know we should not do something. Right. Well, and Satan tempts us all the time to do something wrong. He's not sleeping most of the time. He's actually pretty active. And Satan knows what our weaknesses are pretty well. And Lord does too. So we ask the Lord for help with our weaknesses and help us to have strength to fight against temptation, and especially in making our decisions. And what Solomon has said many times is rely on the Lord and you'll be just fine. When you stop doing that and you stop following the Lord's way, that's when you start having trouble. We see that over and over again. As far as the construction of the temple, had Israel taken on anything like this before, since they became a nation? This was huge. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the Egyptians didn't make the pyramids out of gold either, though, right? So there's gold in them, but they weren't made out of gold. But yeah, right. That was a generational commitment to build those. And here Solomon had 70,000 burden bearers, 80,000 hewers in the mountains. He also had 10,000 a month laborers, 2 months at home and a month working. Plus he sent, this is a lot of people, 10,000. Can you think about 10,000 people? One of your biggest challenges is communications when you got 10,000 people. That's why they had so many supervisors. I think somebody calculated there were one supervisor for every 50 or 60 people. Because otherwise, how would you ever tell people what they needed to do and coordinate with each other? So this is really complex. In 1 Kings 5:13, we just read, he raised a levy out of all Israel, and the levy was 30,000 men. And we just talked about them being divided, and Adoniram was in charge of acquiring this new workforce. So this was two nations, at least, Tyre working with Israel to do all this work together. And they were from Phoenicia, working side by side all of those years. And the writer here was wondering if they did not wonder what they were doing it for. It didn't say that the Phoenicians were saved or they accept God as their God, but for sure they could see that Israel was most certainly focused on serving their God. And so it was an example for all of them. Mm-hmm. That they want a king. Yeah. There's a price. Mm-hmm. And it was good for the people to be conscripted into it, because when you're conscripted into it, you're focused on that, right?
Well, when you talk about conscript draft,
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about against your will. Yeah, whether
Well, yeah, right.
and so you know, that itself can create challenges.
Mm-hmm.
You know, again, this was a worthy project,
Mm-hmm.
but don't think that every time the king says, "I've decided I want more for myself,"
Yeah.
and you're just in this case, where did this favor come from? It came from the people who were working the land and trying to provide for their families.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were conscripted to give up a month out of every 3 to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you were teetering, if you were challenged to provide for your family, well, you're under that much more challenge. And again, I'm not trying to say this was not a worthy project. Don't get me wrong.
Mm-hmm.
This was God's direction.
Mm-hmm.
But Samuel gave a warning specific to. And so this, well, yeah, I hate to belabor, but the bottom line is this led to governments determining what's yours is ours. It's mine.
Mm-hmm.
And that, again, God.
Yeah. It's not like we have that today, right? Right, we do. We have that all the time. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I registered for a selective service. They never called me anything, but I did register. Other people have, and other people even gave their lives for that.
Vietnam.
Yeah.
I mean, we see what the draft was like there.
Yeah.
The refusal to go.
Yeah.
And that's a good example.
Mm-hmm.
People bucking.
Yeah. In this case, parable of the sower again. Samuel told them, be careful what you wish for, and they said, no, we got to have it. This is a natural byproduct of that happening, right? As you just pointed out. So they had a lot of workers doing it. This was for 7 years. That's a long time to have 10,000 people working on a construction project. It didn't really say much about rework. I know any of us that work for any shops that build things. I know Brother Homer worked at Ford. I work at an airplane factory. We hear about rework all the time and things done wrong and whatever. You don't see too much of that in what we see here. Just the fact that all these things were prefabricated. And when you see chapter 6, verse 7, and the house, when it was in building, was built of stone made ready before it was brought thither, so that there was neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron heard in the house while it was building. That's amazing. That just shows you that God was in it. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. And it was done right. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah, how much leftover do you have when you're done? because you didn't do it right in the first place. God's blessings was all over this work that they were doing, and it was really building a house for God was the intent. And Solomon focused on the Lord while he was doing this. The focus wasn't on him; the focus was on the Lord.
Same splendor of the work was done in the tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
describes things in the tabernacle, how they wove beaten strands of gold that and wove it into the curtains
Mm-hmm.
of the tabernacle. And this is great.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, when you got into the Holy of Holies, everything was gold in there. The floor, just all of it. And that's where the Ark of the Covenant was stored in the temple. Another thing, when you got inside of the building, much of the cedar was there, pretty much covering up all of the stone. So it was pretty lavish for where they were.
When I think about it, it's amazing at the work that went into that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? How do you beat gold into a string? And yet, they did.
Yeah. And make things with it, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you think about
Yeah. It sure is.
When you look at pictures, today we can see pictures of the Wailing Wall.
Mhm.
That was a part of it. Those huge stones. There were stones there as big as this church building. And they moved it up there, and it fit perfectly when they brought it in. Put it in.
well, those stones though weren't a part of the first tabernacle. Those are the first temple. They were a part of Herod's. He built the temple bigger by using those, bringing in those stones.
But when you think about the methods they had to work with,
Oh, God. Yeah. I've been there and seen some of those. They're big.
Yeah, and I didn't know this. I looked it up online this morning and got surprised that in Brazil they have something they're calling Solomon's Temple, which they tried to build a replica of it. When I looked at it, it didn't exactly look like what I expected to see, but it's an interesting story if you take a look at it. And I guess it's become more or less a tourist attraction from what I could tell. I also talked here about the olive wood, and this was wood that was in Israel pretty much everywhere, and that the inner sanctuary of the temple, there were 2 cherubim that were 15 feet tall that were made out of olive wood, and each wing on each cherubim was about 7.5 feet long. So the wingspan was also about 15 feet. And then they were overlaid with pure gold, which would have certainly made them to look more just unbelievably outstanding as far as anything we would see here on earth. And it talks about some of the other things. And the whole project was finished. That's another thing. So the project was finished. How many times do you see projects started that don't get finished? I mean, go look at the airport, right? We got a runway, you could land 2 space shuttles at the same time on it. But what about the infrastructure around it? So it looks like it was incomplete. And then, I don't know if you noticed, I do because I drive by there every day, the buildings that used to be McDonnell Douglas, the factory right there, that then became Boeing, then I got out of there, it's being torn down now. So every day you go by, you can see bulldozers and construction equipment deconstructing it and hauling it off. And so it's pretty interesting to see. But Solomon finished the job when he was 26 years old. I don't know anybody who's 26 years old that accomplished anything like that. And of course, God led him and God advised him and helped him through the whole thing. But what a testimony to his obedience that he followed the Lord's will and was able to complete it. After that, it says Solomon built a house, and his house took 13 years to build, and it was pretty extravagant. It was also built from the wood from the forest of Lebanon. It was 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall, and made out of cedar mostly. He also made a house for Pharaoh's daughter, who he married as his first wife in 1 Kings 7 and 8. And he used precious stones and all those sorts of things when he did that as well. They had a couple of other things there that were built in the temple. It mentions a craftsman named Hiram. There was a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre. He had a reputation for being a skilled craftsman, working with metal. He made some special bronze pillars and decorations. He also made a large basin that was called the Molten Sea. He also made bronze stands to hold decorative items. Once the temple was finally complete, Solomon dedicated items from his father and placed them in the treasuries. This included gold, silver, special vessels that he had collected during his reign. So this was a huge part of his life, but only the beginning of Solomon's reign. He did this as the first priority. And so it took 7 years, but then he did a lot of things after that. And we're going to see that next week's lesson. All right, it's time to eat.